I'm just curious, before we begin, how many of you were at the screening last night? Okay, very good. So you won't mind that the clips I show don't look very good. You've already seen how it's supposed to look. Good. Well, I'd like to begin by acknowledging Richard and Margaret Beck and their generous legacy. I suspect that I'm the only Beck lecturer who actually met Richard back in the 70s when my father was the president of the Icelandic National League and he used to come by the house. Although I didn't at the time ever anticipate I'd be here in Victoria speaking at a Beck lecture. And I'd like to thank John Tucker, whose tireless effort to get me here. We've been discussing this, I think, for a year, if not longer, year and a half. And every time I phoned to say, sorry, I can't make that date, I thought it would be the last time I heard from him, but it never was. So let me start talking about why Beowulf. Why make a movie about Beowulf? And I think to begin with, for me, there's a personal relationship to the work. And what it is, you know, I'm an immigrant. I came to Canada when I was 6, and English is my second language. And when I was in high school, I was exposed to Beowulf. And I was astonished to find, when reading it, that I could actually read it, sort of. And for me, it gave me just a tremendous sense of enfranchisement in the Canadian culture as an immigrant to discover that my native tongue actually is one of the two main components of the English language, which I didn't know. So I've always had a soft spot for the poem. I rediscovered it later as a parent. I used to read it to my son, who fancies himself a warrior. And he loved it. He loved it for different reasons. He loved the action, the earthiness, the monster, the hero, all that stuff that makes Beowulf the granddaddy of the hero myth in our culture. But I still didn't really have any plans to adapt it. That came several years later. I had just finished making a film with Andrew Berzins. Actually, a film set in Victoria, partially. It was about Daryl Huneman, the boy who hired a couple of his pals to murder his mother and grandmother because they were about to spend the inheritance on a reno. The experience of that film was quite successful for us, and the working relationship was good. And so we decided that we should do something else together. And so we were tossing around a lot of ideas. And what tends to happen, I think, in Canada, you know, oftentimes we limit our horizons. And, you know, we were talking about all kinds of things that we thought we could get made, but none of them terribly exciting to us. And then I sort of, you know, said, well, Andrew, what do you really want to do? And he said, I want to do Beowulf. And he said, what do you really want to do? And I said, I want to make a saga picture. So we said, okay, let's do it. And that's how this thing sort of started. You know, it was a perfect fit. It was exciting, totally unfinanceable. And if I'd known at the time that it was going to be a 7-year journey, I don't think I would have embarked on it. But such is the way with many great journeys. How Beowulf? Having decided to make the film, the question arises. I mean, why bother? What's the point? Who needs another museum film? What is the take? What's the point of view? What does it have to do with our present moment? And in what way is it relevant to an audience today? So those are the kind of questions we started asking ourselves. You know, because oftentimes you decide you want to do something for a gut reason, but you have to work through an intellectual process to understand why and what it means and how to do it. And for me, the answer that I arrived at was that this poem is the prototype of the hero myth in our culture. And as we were developing the script, the warrior culture on the planet Earth was on the rise. You know, the tribalism of the Balkans and ultimately the madness of the Bush-Cheney era, the constant invocations of good and evil that were flying around. And these were sentiments that I grew up in the 70s. in a more secular humanist era. I thought that the civilized world had moved on from those ideas. But they hadn't, we hadn't. So I began reading the poem through those eyes. And it started to become for me a story about how we create monsters. It's about people huddled around a fire in the darkness, fearful of what lies outside. And it brought me back, surprisingly, to sort of primal state that I recall experiencing as a child in the dark, long, dark Icelandic winters, and sort of strange dreams and memories of that time. Which was all well and good, but what does that mean practically? You know, how do you turn that into a movie? To begin with, we said, let's take this story back to its pagan roots. It likely began as a campfire tale. It was recounted and evolved over hundreds of years, providing many a scope with a tale to sing for their supper. And knowing that stories evolve in the oral storytelling tradition, and that like television writers today, that poets were rewarded by their ability to one-up another, we took a license to riff on this story. And that's what I consider the film. I consider it more of a riff on the film than a faithful adaptation. Although I think that we kept. I don't think the poet would roll over in his grave. I think that the spirit of the poem is there. In preparing for this lecture, I went back through my files and I had a look at the sales pitch that I presented 7 years ago. I wanted to see what did I say I was going to do and see if it bore any relationship to what we actually did. And I'm going to read it to you. Unless it gets boring, then I'll edit. But I found it quite interesting, actually, when I read it yesterday. This is what I said. On its most basic level, this is a film about primal fear, severed heads, and things that lurk in the shadows of a stark northern landscape. The story of a people terrorized by a bloodthirsty troll and the hero who comes to vanquish it. It takes place in a powerful landscape, the south coast of Iceland, where Europe's biggest glacier meets the North Atlantic, a land of volcanoes, lava fields, black sands, waterfalls, and brooding ocean. A dusky, primordial land of endless twilight, where people huddle together against the barren, haunted land that surrounds them. It is loosely adapted from the Anglo-Saxon epic poem Beowulf, the archetype of the modern hero myth as we know it. While the story is medieval, the interpretation is contemporary. The aim is not to illustrate the myth, but to reinterpret it from a modern perspective. Our mythic hero, Beowulf, is not a simple man acting out a simple morality tale. He's a complex, thinking character, aware of the myth that has grown up around him, even as he grows to question the righteousness of his quest. The troll, Grendel, is not the supernatural embodiment of evil portrayed in the poem, but rather a creature of the natural world, capable of the same basic feelings as the men who hunt him. Thus, thematically, the story becomes an exploration of tribalism and ethnic cleansing, of man's impulse to kill that which he doesn't understand. The look and action of the film is elemental. You should be able to smell the blood when it flows. We may use some digital effects. In the end, we didn't actually. But this is, in essence, an analog film. Grendel is bound by the laws of nature. His strength is that of a 400-pound creature of exceptional speed and cunning, driven by a powerful bloodlust exuding the aura of invincibility. His arms can break a neck, his claws eviscerate a man, and his rank smell can make you pass out. But the important thing about him is his character, his ability to feel rage, fear, loneliness, amusement. His face and body will be prosthetically sculpted, and he will learn a range of movements unique to the Troll clan, much like the actors at the beginning of Space Odyssey, who became apes through their mastery of primate body language. His power will be enhanced through stunt choreography and wire work, but most importantly, he will have at his core an essence of humanity that makes him a worthy adversary to Beowulf and gives his inevitable death a tragic dimension. The tone of the story will be leavened with humor, striving for an effect not unlike that of Unforgiven, where the conventions of a familiar genre apply, but the character's self-awareness and that of the filmmakers temper its earnestness. On a personal level, Beowulf and Grendel represents an exploration of my own tribal roots through the prism of my adopted culture, an opportunity to take the kind of saga that scared the bejesus out of me as a child during the long, dark Icelandic winters and adapt it to my understanding of the 21st century we live in now. So looking back on the document, I was sort of stunned that that's kind of the film I made. Because, and this is not the first time that I've experienced this. When you make a film, you start out with the essence of an idea. And then you go on this great long journey. You know, John Ford used to say that making a movie was like a stagecoach ride. You know, at the beginning, all you're thinking, you're just very excited thinking about the beautiful grand vistas ahead. You know, and after all the dust and the end of the ride, you just want to get there. And that's kind of what a film is like. And so it always astonishes me, and I take it as a good sign when I get to the end and the film is actually pretty similar to what I set out to do. I think that's an interesting document also from the perspective of anybody who's in the movie business or is interested in the movie business, because that essentially is a sales document. That's a sales pitch. That is the document that raised the money that got the script going. And from a film perspective, and I say this to the film students all the time, that you can't write a pitch until you've actually done some work and get a handle on what your take on the material is. If you don't understand your point of view, you can't do it. That's the first step, always. So basically, we conceive this as a campfire tale. And the question then is, well, if it began around the campfire, what actually happened? What were the events on which the tale was built? We wanted to stay away from fantasy and root the film in the natural world, and thus Grendel was born in our minds as a big guy, a Neanderthal or Humanus Giganticus from down the valley with a blood feud to settle. What blood feud? Thus is born the father, who of course is not in the poem, and the opening scene, which never really changed much from how it appeared in the very first draft of the script. I'm going to show it to you. It's about 3 minutes long. I know most of you have seen it, but now you have the pleasure of seeing it looking really bad. Then I'll take one or two questions afterwards about it, because it raises some interesting questions. And then I'll continue on. And that's kind of the pattern that I'm going to establish through this remaining 40 minutes. The challenge here, the reason that I liked this sequence as written when I first saw it, and the reason it hardly changed at all, is that it provided, without a word of dialogue, it created the entire genesis of the feud and spans a generation and introduces all the main characters in I think, a very non-expository way. So, Grendel's father falling off the cliff, by the way, is not slow motion. That's just how far it is. Just on a technical basis, if you're interested, I mean, again, we're sort of dealing here with a very analog approach to filmmaking. You have a fully articulated dummy being basically launched from a rocket launcher off that big cliff. The only thing that really changed from the initial writing is that Andrew told me he always anticipated that it was like a 30-foot drop. So when he came to Iceland and saw that I'd chosen the biggest cliff in Iceland, he was happy. Any questions about that before I continue on? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering, later in the film it talks about how Grendel was Hrothgar for his father's death. Was it actually Hrothgar that shot him with the arrows? Or did he mean to specify who actually shot?
Oh, the question is, was it actually Hrothgar who shot the arrows? No, Hrothgar is leading the charge, and he tosses the tar sack that's ignited that sends him off the edge of the cliff. Sorry, there's somebody here as well. Yeah.
I was wondering if the tape preserving of the head thing, besides just did Grendel do, is there anything precedent?
Well, he wanted to take something home. And the old man was too big. So I think it's from I guess, storytelling perspective, it was intended to, first of all, to sort of show that we're living in a very primal time, and to create the, the desiccated, to sort of show the genesis of the desiccated skull, which is the shrine that Hanshao later desecrates, and thus sealing his fate. So that was kind of the thinking behind it. So, and this opening for me kind of seemed to fit with the historical period. You know, a pre-Christian era where the blood feud was the determining social code. And it worked for the contemporary transportation as well. So anybody with any experience in the matter will tell you that if you're going to engage in ethnic cleansing, you better kill the children, or they'll come back and get you. And I'm not talking about Gaza, necessarily. And that's Hrothgar's downfall. You know, he's a man caught between two ethos. He's a warrior king, and he should have killed Grendel, right, and spared his people Grendel's wrath. But he's also a human being, and out of compassion, he spares the child. In retrospect, he sees that moment as his moment of downfall, of weakness, the moment that doomed his people. But Beowulf, who is a more modern character, who's born into a changing era, sees that as a moment of compassion. But he also realizes later, when Selma says, "So Hrothgar taught you nothing," he realizes that he has done exactly the same thing. He has killed Grendel in front of, and the child remains. So he realizes that he has to make some gesture to end that cycle. Thus, the scene in the cave where he says, "Is that your father? Be proud," and the building of the cairn, and the sleeping, the line, "Sleep, Grendel," the intention to honor the foe. Hrothgar is caught between two ethos, and echoes the sense, I think, of the historical moment, the interregnum. One of the defining characteristics, I think, of the epic is that it takes place at a time of great change. And in this case, the arrival of Christianity in the north and the twilight of the gods and the emergence of the one God idea begins to take hold. Thus, Hrothgar's gods have deserted him, perhaps because of that moment of that act of weakness or compassion. And now he's adrift and eventually chooses to be baptized, not because he particularly believes, but true to all Norsemen, he's a practical man, and he's desperate, and he'll try anything. And herein comes one of the other inventions in this in the film that doesn't exist in the poem, and that is both the Brendan character, played by Eddie Marzan, who we sort of loosely based on Saint Brendan, who at the time was making his way through the north, preaching the gospel. And the scope, Thorkel, who starts out as a pagan, ends up a Christian, and is, in our telling, likely the author of the poem itself, the now official version, and whose tale, according to Thorfinn, is shit. And Selma, who also doesn't exist in the poem. And we created her basically as a manifestation of the pagan faith, the witch, whore, outcast, who articulates many of Andrew's themes. She allows us to articulate those themes, and if you're going to cast Jerry Butler, you got to get a girl. So, and the fact that she fucks trolls makes her kind of interesting to me too. People have said that the film. Some people have said the film is anti-Christian, which I don't think is true. We make as much fun of Beowulf as we do of Brendan, though personally my sympathies are with Beowulf. The idea that this was a pagan tale rendered to manuscript by a converted Norseman, and our bringing it back to its pagan roots with a nod to the genesis of the poem in its written form. We chose only to deal with the first part of the poem. Those of you who know the poem, just out of curiosity, who's read the poem? Excellent. Very good. Yeah, so I mean, this is the first third of the poem. And thus the title, Beowulf and Grendel. And our distributors hated us. You know, Grendel, Gretel, who? Hansel, Gretel, what in the hell? Why can't you just call it Beowulf? But, you know, again, for us, the theme that we wanted to articulate was manifest in that relationship between Beowulf and Grendel. I had read John Gardner's Grendel. Andrew hadn't. He has now, but once we started on this thing, he decided he better not read it until we got through the end. The latter parts of the story, you know, Beowulf's rise to power as a king and his battle with the dragon, we decided to save for another day, maybe someday. It's kind of an anti-epic epic, a subversion of the hero myth, attempting to incorporate modernity and salty pagan humor. A lot of people have commented on the dialogue, the swearing. The dialogue, to begin with, is virtually, well, every single spoken word in it is Norse root English. There are no romantic root words spoken. And we've traced fuck back to 1400. Cunt is an old English word, too. I'm not quite sure that those were the words that they used, but we wanted to stay away from the sort of ye olde Shakespearean, you know, if it took place in the past, they must talk that funny talk kind of filmmaking. We wanted to sort of portray these guys as, and I mentioned this last night, as kind of like a group of bikers, you know, guys, young guys, out for an adventure, you know, drinking and fighting and winning and getting laid and giving treasures and going home with stories to tell. And so that's why we sort of peppered their language with a salty dialogue. Kind of the un-Lord of the Rings approach. And it's a purely analog film, as I mentioned before. The decision to use no visual effects at all and rely instead on old-fashioned movie making. And this is part of what I think makes the movie live in the natural world and have a sense of being real, because with computer-generated imagery, even if it's very, very realistic, the minute that that your characters defy any kind of rules of nature, rules of gravity, your eyes may believe it, but you take a step back from it, and I think you no longer engage in it as something which has significance or meaning in the real world. You know, you look at Lord of the Rings, and you know, once they're sort of slayed the 60th creature and they're laughing and heads are rolling, it doesn't, to me, it doesn't feel like anything anymore. I don't feel it. But that's my theory. The other guys are making a lot more money than me, though, so I could be wrong. And it made for some really interesting challenges, you know, how to do the stunts. And what I discovered was that there's a whole universe of filmmakers out there who basically became obsolete around the time that Jurassic Park came out. There's the prosthetics makers, the stunt guys who do wire work, all that kind of stuff is increasingly becoming obsolete, but there was a wealth of talent to tap into. You know, how do you know, Grendel whacks somebody and he flies across the room. How do you do that? Well, you have a wire attached to him and you yank him and he flies across the room. Grendel's arm, which I'll get to because it's sort of one of the central images of the poem. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the idea of a Viking ship in an iceberg, you know, in an iceberg passage? For me, that Viking ship, that is a ship called Islendingurinn. It was built by a captain who lives in Vestmannaey, and he sailed it from Iceland to Lancel Meadows in the year 2000 to commemorate the first landing of Europeans in North America, and then down to New York for the millennium. The ship was then sent back to Iceland, where it was in a museum until we got a hold of it. And our challenge was to get it out of the museum halfway around the country into an iceberg-filled lagoon and drive. We had to go over 3 or 4 bridges, all of which were narrower than the ship itself. So the discussions about, will we helicopter it over the bridge? Will we, you know, all those kind of really practical things that you end up dealing with. But anyway, we did succeed, and for me that ship became kind of a metaphor for the film. So I'm going to show you 2 clips here, one that have to do with the difficulty of getting it there, and the other that show you the sort of the result. And I think it's interesting also from the point of view of seeing what the film looks like versus what's the madness that's going on behind the scenes. So I'm going to start first with a scene from Wrath of Gods.
The Viking ship arrives, but since it is too wide to take it across a single-lane bridge, the idea is to float it to the other side of the glacier lagoon where it needs to land up. For the schedule to work, the ship needs to be ready in 48 hours.
For me, that ship represented the production. You know, it's like if we could do that, we could do anything. If we could get a real Viking ship halfway around the country, across bridges that were narrower than the ship itself, into an iceberg-filled lagoon, and put sheep and Vikings on it, and make it sail, we could make the movie.
As the ship is lowered into the water, the first mate notices a problem. The ship leaks like a seal.
We have a leaky boat. It's a metaphor for the film.
We did get it into the ocean, into the lagoon.
Beowulf goes at dawn to the Danes, all you who go along. Keep us proud! And if you can, find Hancho a wife, our sheep have had enough.
And there you have a couple of things going on. You have the sort of the mythological passage through to another place, another realm. You have the foreshadowing of Hancho's death. You have the sort of casual existence of creatures that are not human. The ship, it looks beautiful. When we were actually filming that, we had water pumps in it, pumping water out, and whenever we'd roll, we turned the pump off for sound, and somebody would sit in the bottom, and the water was rising like really quickly, until the captain would say, "Do you want to die?" And I'd say, "Cut." So, are we done at 12:30? I guess I should pick up the pace, eh? The other challenges, that we approached that offered opportunities to explore themes and characters. The battle in the poem happens pretty much immediately. Beowulf shows up, he slays the monster, they feast, they drink, and get gifts. That would have made a very short movie. So that's where the kind of existential mystery comes into play in this adaptation. Grendel won't fight the Geats. He's got his own code of honor, slaying only those who have wronged him, and an intelligence. He slays all those around Hrothgar, knowing that it's a greater torment to Hrothgar to kill everybody around him than it is to kill Hrothgar. And Beowulf begins to see this, and he begins to uncover the mystery, but ultimately, blood and loyalty is stronger than ideas. And once Hancho desecrates Grendel's shrine, Grendel's father's shrine, the events take on a life of their own. Hancho must die, and Beowulf must avenge him. So how to kill him? In the poem, they go mano a mano, and Beowulf, who has the strength of 200 men, rips his arm off. How do you do that if you've committed to the natural world? What Andrew invented for that was the idea that Beowulf ties the rope around his wrist. Grendel tries to escape. He jumps. He's caught like an animal. He cuts his own arm off. I think you've all seen that. I was going to play the clip, but I don't think I will. Those are the kind of practical story, practical problem-solving things that you have to deal with when you make a choice, like the choice being, say, that there's no computer-generated imagery. The production design itself, this is the migration era. It's not a very documented era, unlike, say, the Viking Age. The mead hall was built using virtually all old tools, mostly driftwood, a little bit of plywood. And it's pretty much a replica of the mead hall that people believe is Heorot. that was discovered, I believe, in Norway, or in Denmark, I guess, since it was that. The costuming, I'm just going to read Deborah's notes, my costume designer, on the notes. She says, when Sturla and I first met to discuss the design for Beowulf and Grendel, he had several strong desires and creative images in mind. The clothes were to grow out of the earth and fit naturally into the Icelandic landscape chosen for Geatland and Daneland. The two were to have distinct color palettes and tribal flavor. Sturla wanted the clothes to be realistic in look and feel, researched to reflect the pre-Viking migration era, and of course to indicate the individual life of each character. The question of truth to period was in continual discussion, reality or fantasy. The decision and task was to create a plausible world, one that had a strong, secure nod to historical reality. But we were not to be slaves to documentary evidence. This allowed a root and range of visual style and gave us freedom for imagination to rule. We discussed an overall image to inspire the process. We settled on diamonds in the mud, a brilliant guide for me to follow. On poring over the visual research, I was struck by its obvious practicality, the simplicity of line and shape, the exquisite decorative detail, the use of symbolic images on jewelry, sword, belts, helmets, and leather work gave us a wide opportunity for choice and individuality. We were also fascinated by the evidence of extensive far-flung travels to the east and its inevitable influence on the clothing. And I think I'm going to skip that clip too. During our first sort of pitch of this story, and what drew me to the story more so than anything else was the basic landscape, the power of that landscape. It was one of the motivators for making the film. And so the first thing I did once I raised a little bit of money was I got Andrew over onto that landscape to see it. And this was a hugely important first step. And I think for those of you who are writers, you can't underestimate the value and the importance of getting on a plane. You can never go wrong getting on an airplane. You need to go there. You need to walk the land, smell the air, feel what you feel if you're going to write about it. And it did. It showed in his writing, and it provided a huge role in the investors actually having confidence in the film, because the first draft that he wrote, regardless of its shortcomings, had such a powerful atmosphere that people felt that it had drawn them into a world. And that's really what people are looking for in a movie. Did it take me somewhere that I've never been before? It also exposed Andrew to the very dry, salty, sort of fatalistic sensibility of Icelanders, which is reflected in the writing. One of the scenes, again, that I'm not going to show you because most of you saw it last night, but is the sort of the troll pissing on the door. That's very Icelandic. You know, it's like that could have been right out of a saga, but it was out of Andrew's head instead. In the landscape, it helps you understand the characters themselves because it's so overwhelming and they're so small. The elements are alive and present, and you begin to see the gods, the many gods, as a manifestation of the elements at play. In making the film, the landscape also became a major factor in production design and cinematic approach. My production designer, Árni Páll, would take me to sort of his special magic places, and he would test me. It was like he would take me to one, and it would be really hard to get to. And if I really liked it and said, no, we'll make it work, then he'd take me to another one. And little by little, he took me to all his magic places. And they were all impractical. They were all very, hard to get to and hard to shoot in. But it became really clear to me and to the cinematographer that that was the look of the film. And so the first thing we sort of decided from a production point of view was leave the toys at home. We don't need the crane. We don't need all the toys that we're used to working with. Let's get as portable as we can. Let's invest the time and the energy to get the camera to these places that are going to take your breath away. And it was not without its cost. This was, the production was punted. because financing took forever to close. We were supposed to shoot in the summer. We ended up shooting in the stormiest winter in 60 years in Iceland. We lost 4 base camps. One day we lost 14 vehicles to wind. You know, we were down as often as we weren't. But it was beautiful, and it became a character in the film. I'm just going to show you a little clip that that sort of revolves around us waiting out the weather.
Don't go up the mountain, guys. There's rocks flying around everywhere.
The mountains are snowy just outside of Reykjavik. We have ice on the road. Okay, Holly, drive very, very cautiously, okay?
I'm good. A little breezy up here. No, it's beautiful. But not everybody agrees, though.
Right now, the situation on the road is that it's only safe for transport to be driving on that road. Our priorities from a production point of view are to get hair, makeup, and wardrobe shuttled to the top of the hill, get whatever supplies they need, and get them to town hall so we can start processing the actors for scene 38. And everybody else can just stand down until further notice, but that's our game plan, is to try and incrementally get ready for scene 38. And once we have a roadblock at the road, and once we feel it's safe and everyone can go up, we'll let you all know.
I like it. I love it. But I'm good for this, but you know, we can't do it now. We need cameras, we need costumes. Great dogma. Picture.
Have you heard of dogma, says Stellan. I think, do you know what dogma is? Dogma filmmaking? It's a philosophy of filmmaking. No costumes, basically the camera and the actors, no production issues. Just shoot it. Anyway, but for me, these locations, they became a sort of a central theme in the film. They were impractical, but they also, I think, very strongly influenced the performances themselves. Stellan said that acting on that landscape was like being in a scene with a powerful, there was always another character in the scene, and it was a powerful, unpredictable character, and you never knew what he was going to do, but you had to be able to react to it. So it's impossible, he said, to create a stale performance in a situation like that, because no matter how you researched it, it's not going to be that way when you're standing there and the wind is blowing at 140K and you're just trying to not get blown over. I'll talk a little bit about casting. The basic principle was that I felt it was very important to have characters who swam out of that gene pool, and they had to be manly men. And there's actually not an awful lot of manly men out there who can act and swing a sword. There's lots of manly men who can swing a sword, but they can't act. And there's lots of guys that can act, but they don't have that kind of thing. And so that was really a long, drawn-out process. And finding Jerry Butler was really, it turned the key. It made the film happen, because he was just coming off of Phantom of the Opera. He was hot. His willingness to make the film gave the investors the peace of mind that they needed. And you know, he already knew how to, you know, he's quite familiar with swords and horses and all that stuff. That's what he does. You know, he had done it many, many times before. So, you know, his choice was simple. His buddies, we called them the pacemakers, Jerry and the pacemakers. Tony and Rory and Martin, we cast them all out of the UK. The theory being that as long as the this being migration era, the theory was that I would cast UK actors as Geats and Icelandic actors as Danes, and that the accents would sort of roughly kind of work in a modern sort of way. What I didn't take into account, of course, is that it does work, but Sarah sounds to me perfect, but of course her accent doesn't swim out of the Atlantic, and so it wasn't until I got to the cutting room and I went, geez, I wish I'd asked her to do a little Icelandic accent. But I still love her performance, and I just put it down to another modernism. Grendel, how that character emerged. You know, how do you create that guy? This is, I talked about this a little bit last night. This is, there's something that they say, let the actor act with his skin. Allow the actor to create the character. And that was sort of the central idea that Nick Dudman, our prosthetic designer, came across, or brought to the project. That we used Grendel, when I cast Ingvar, who's sort of Iceland's #1 actor. He's really quite an extraordinary actor. And by the way, the little boy at the beginning is his son. And it's an acting family. But the process of creating that character was very much about improvisation. It was about getting him in front of mirrors. It was about, you know, putting bits of clothing and costuming and prosthetics and hair, and little by little allowing that character to emerge. You know, it's how can a character, you know, how do you take somebody who basically has not a line of dialogue and who eats Danes for breakfast and make him an empathetic character? And that was Ingvar's job. And I think he did an astonishing job of it. Again, I had a clip I was going to show you, but I don't think I will, because you've seen it. Money. You can't make a film without money. And when you're making an international film, it takes a lot of money, a lot of lawyers, a lot of complexity. It's a bit like, they say it's a bit like democracy and a bit like the making of sausages. It's best that you see the result and not the process. But I will show you a little bit of the process. This is us in pre-production trying to close the financing while getting the film set up and ready to go.
So I've got to call Jason back and kick him about this stuff. They're threatening to pull the plug right now.
Every day we were becoming more and more aware of the fact that we had, you know, we were out of step. We were spending money, you know, there was more money going out than there was coming in.
I think that the original budgets that were done by a production manager that we'd hired, you know, I think that she had never been to Iceland, never knew the realities of working in Iceland, and was living in a dream world.
I know, the problem is that in this little town, there's nobody available. There's no humans that aren't working as fishermen. Much better rate than we pay.
So when we were faced with the realities of the fact that you couldn't hire a university student to drive a car because they weren't going to make enough money, you know, the realities really struck home for us. It is, if not the most expensive country in Europe, just about. So it became very clear that the budget that we had been working from was not the budget that was going to make the film.
Yeah, no, you know, we're aware of it.
Since the budget was approved, the Icelandic krona has appreciated by close to 20%. There are rumors flying around the office that the film will be at least $1 million over budget. The co-production deals are not signed yet, and the whole thing could fall apart if the financiers lose faith in the production.
Why only $1 million?
Who said we're $1 million?
We had a budget that was ballooning.
We had financing that hadn't closed, and because the financing hadn't closed, we didn't have cash flow. Without cash flow, we're paying more for everything, which is causing the budget to balloon even more. And it's causing postponements, and every postponement causes the budget to balloon. And we can't talk about it because we're trying to get the financing to close before we come clean with what's actually going on with the budget. Welcome to the world of film financing. The director's job is to keep it going. The director is the ship's captain. The director, from the moment that the ship sets sail until the time that the ship returns to port, is the person that is responsible for this thing. People look to the director not just for talent, but also for leadership and mad commitment. The minute that a crew begins to sense that the director is wavering from his or her purpose, they will bail. You lose them. It's a terrifying thing. I've seen it happen. And when you're in a challenging circumstances like this, that was a very real possibility at any time. My DP my director of photography had done a lot of films, very experienced guy, and there were times when I just thought, I don't know how we're going to carry on here. We're like, I'm shooting in a storm. I don't even know what I'm shooting because I can't hear it, and I don't know if there's, like, I think what we're shooting is shit. And he just said, Sturla, as long as you have film, as long as you have actors, you keep going. Just keep shooting. That's what you do. You just keep moving left foot, right foot, until either there's no film or there's no actors. And that's kind of what we did. This is a very short clip, but this is basically me now, very punch drunk. After about 10 days of intense storm, I think that this was when we lost our base camp and all manner of other stuff. And there was a tremendous pressure from the producers and from the production guarantor, who by this point was on set, to cut the script. Right? That's their solution is, okay, we'll cut the script, shoot less. And so you have to be kind of unwavering in your madness, which I think I was at the time.
How far you gone now in terms of the film? How much do you have left?
Yeah, we're about halfway through. Depending on how far behind we are, quite sure.
Are you behind?
Yes, of course.
What are you going to do about it?
Just keep shooting.
Are you going to extend? Are you going to cut down scenes? What are you looking at now in terms of getting this film done?
Just keep plugging away until it's finished. That's your job. That's what you do if you're directing a film. And it's human nature. People look to leadership, and they want to be a part of something that they can believe in. And if they believe in the director, they will go through all manner of hell, as long as they believe that the director believes, and they believe that there's a vision there that they're trying to serve that has some meaning to them. Just a few things about post-production. The score is by Gunnarsson. Hilmar is known as the pagan priest. He's actually the high priest of Ausatru, which is the Icelandic pagan religion. So he marries people and he does pagan rituals. He's also the producer of Sigur Rós, and kind of a legendary Icelandic guy. And the score that he provided was heavily sort of influenced by Alexander Scriabin, his mystic chord, his Prometheus chord, kind of an atonal sound that he has working through there. The Sigur Rós guys are playing with all of their weird stuff. One of the instruments that I love that plays on there is what they call the stone marimba, which is they go around the glaciers and they gather up stones that they've gotten that have come out from under the glaciers, and they tap them. They, oh, that's a sea. You know, that's an E minor. And they build this humongous stone marimba thing, and it plays throughout. It's kind of the inner sound of Grendel's madness is the stone marimba. The editing is I work with the same editor as often as I can. There's sort of basically the idea, people say in filmmaking, there's the movie you wrote, there's the movie you shot, and there's the movie you edit. And it's very true. You get into the cutting room, and you have to sort of abandon all of your preconceptions, look at what you have, and restructure it to make it work. And that's what we did. There was not a lot, but a fair bit of restructuring in this film in the cutting room. Now, why did I want to throw to clip 7 here? Well, this is, I guess, the surprise clip. It's the last one. We're getting near the end, and if we have time, I'll take questions. I don't know why we're looking at this, but I'll tell you after. Oh, right. Okay. This is near the end. This is after the the meat hall caught fire. The base camp blew away. We lost 14 vehicles. The financier was trying. The bonder was trying to close down the film, and the sort of to top it off, the volcano that we were like underneath erupted, and this is the day after the volcano erupted.
We haven't had an earthquake yet. Volcano's good though. We haven't had an earthquake, and there's still no frogs falling from the sky. So this we have to be thankful for. I don't know, maybe we should never have blooded that ram over there. Do you think, Stellan? Huh? Do you think that's what brought all this shit on us? Blooding that lamb? No.
You've been so lucky.
We have been lucky.
You've been so lucky, Sturla.
The day after...
Any normal person wouldn't have film at all.
Yeah. Still be on day 3.
Yeah. So, questions?
So how much did the film actually cost to make?
The film, the financing for the film closed about 3 weeks after we wrapped the shoot. And the final budget was $18 million. Not bad. Sort of like a kitchen sink drama in Hollywood. Yeah?
I have a question about Sarah Palmer's character. I just forget her name.
Selma.
Selma, yeah. What, the scene with Grendel, why did you think it was important to add that in? Like, why, like, just that, how she just seems to, like, love him, but rapes her? I was just curious about why you chose to add that in, and then her seemingly had the same love-hate thing with Beowulf.
Well, I think the thing about Grendel for me was that the actual act of sex was, unlike the Danes who had sort of come by, as she said, to spread their seed and cut her throat. For him, it was purely a question of procreation. It was he needed to. He wanted to his line not to die out, and it creates the story point of the child, Sarah, the child that is Selma and Grendel's child. That's why she's protecting him, is that there was a child born of that union. So that was the basic thinking behind that.
Still, you talked about the CGI, but I'm just curious. You got any comments on Zemeckis' version?
You know, Beowulf is a deep sea, and there's room for many, many interpretations. What can I say? Not my cup of tea, though.
I was wondering about the like second to last line in the film, I guess, where the guy says, "Well, the one guy's talking about Cain and Abel, I guess, and the other guy is like, so what's that mean?" Well, it means that, you know, we're all killers. It's like, oh, well, it's full of shit. Like, I was wondering, I know, it sounds like there's kind of a point to be made there, kind of, that you're making. I wasn't quite sure exactly what it was.
Well, we're kind of referring to Thorkel, who's has become the kind of chronicler of the events, and throughout the story is dramatizing them in a way that's, you know, he's mythologizing them in a way that's not, doesn't really conform to what's happening in the story. And eventually he becomes, he too converts and becomes a follower of Brendan. So at the end of the story, he's spinning the tale, which becomes the sort of the official story, you know, it becomes the written Beowulf saga, if you like, in which he talks about Grendel as being this embodiment of evil who was hateful and vengeful and for no particular reason. And so Thorfinn is saying, well, I don't understand, who's Cain? And he explains it to him. And so it's just kind of a throwaway line that's meant to indicate that, you know, as Thorfinn says, we're all killers. You know, life is complicated and morality is ambiguous, and that's sort of what it's an attempt to play at.
I just have a question about the father-son theme in the movie and how he went to such great pains to create a father for Grendel. But the question that I had was just about how, or why he chose not to really show the relationship between Grendel and his mother.
I don't know. I don't know. It didn't seem sort of germane to the telling to the tale, but I'm sure that we could have, and it might have been quite interesting. Nothing. Oh, there we go.
Who exactly do you go to for the finance? Or like special film companies or the banks?
It's very, very complicated. This is like a 3-country official treaty co-production, so that means that in each, the UK, Canada, and Iceland, it's treated as though it were a fully Canadian, fully Icelandic, fully British film. Each of the countries has its own funding instruments. In the UK, they have, it comes primarily from tax-based equity funds. Basically, rich rock and roll stars and footballers get big tax breaks. And they also have what they call a sales and leaseback, which is kind of one of the funny, film financing is full of funny instruments. Sales leaseback was a financing instrument created actually for the building of aircraft. And I'm not even going to get into it. But anyway, in Iceland, there were tax-based investment, there was private investment, and then because it's Icelandic, there was Nordic investment from the Nordic Film Fund. In Canada, there were tax credits, there was distributor advance, there was a telefilm investment, there were television pre-sales. It's basically, for these kind of things, you cobble together financing from many sources, and the lawyers do very well.
But what do you think of the poets of the time who were telling Beowulf what it meant to say about morality to their audience?
Well, that was kind of why we took it back to the pagan roots. To me, the morality of the time would have been more like what you see expressed in the sagas, where you know, the bad guys are usually pretty interesting and complicated, and the good guys aren't always all that good. It's a little more kind of true to human nature, in my experience. Less moralistic. It's the world of many gods, not the world of the sort of the duality of Christianity, which is one God and good and evil.
Are you ever going to make a saga film?
I'd love to. You got any money?
How cheap can you make it?
Yeah, no, I'd love to do the Njal saga. They're hard to make, though, especially in Icelandic. Imagine. Anyways, well, they did the Passion of the Christ in Aramaic. You never know. I'll have to do some kind of a big boffo box office hit first before I get to do that, though.
ask them to finance your movie, do they ask to read your script or the ideas of the film? Like, do they actually go into the details of why you're making the movie and for what purpose?
Well, yes and no. Yes, there are gatekeepers at every step of the way, but each country has its own producers. I mean, we were the producers in Canada. So, for example, Telefilm invested in the film. They absolutely want to read the script because they want to know whether they think that it's going to meet their mandate, which is either to make some money at the box office or have a meaningful kind of cultural impact, or preferably both. Whereas the tax credits, which become a significant part of it, are value neutral. There's no gatekeeper. The tax credit just simply becomes a percentage of your labor spend, for example. So it depends on which of the financiers you're dealing with. Some are involved with the creative and some aren't. And everybody has an opinion. And that's part of the job, is you have to listen to people and be humble enough to sort of listen even to the most sort of lunatic things that you hear, because there may be something valuable in there that people are telling you, and by the same token, that that you can use, and that also makes people feel like you're listening to them if they're giving you their money. And you also have to be very strong-willed and stick to those things that are important to you. But and you also have to be very cagey. You don't. You try not to show your hand ever. I usually have gimmies, creative gimmies that I sort of defend like crazy, but I know I'm going to give them up. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.